Hey everybody, welcome back to the Anyway Whatever podcast. I am your host, Mike Fisher, and today's guest is Nick Emel from the Tennis podcast, not the tennis podcast. Nick and his co-host Brandon do a top 10 list podcast. It's my favorite podcast right now, and I wanted to have him on to come and talk about it so he could share his show with you guys, my audience. It's like, you get to learn something while you're laughing. The chemistry between the two of them is really great. So I was happy Nick was able to come on and talk about his show. And I got to know Nick a little bit as a person. As I always say on this show, new friends is one of my favorite parts about doing this show. As always, if you are listening to the podcast version of this, hit subscribe wherever it is that you get your podcast content. Give us a review, share the episode with people you think might be interested in what we got going on over here. And if you are watching on YouTube, hit subscribe and click the bell, like, share, and comment. And of course, we have shirts and merch now, and you can find the links to those stores in the description below. And yeah, enjoy this episode with Nick. And go check out his podcast, the Tennis Podcast. I think my people will like what him and his show are all about. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Anyway Whatever podcast. I'm your host, Mike Fisher, and today's guest is Nick Emel from the Tennis Podcast, which happens to currently be right now my favorite podcast. Hey Nick, how are you?
Hey man, thanks for having me.
Of course. Happy to. Happy that you decided to be on. It's like I'm at that. I still ask a lot of people that I want to have on the show to be on the show, and every single time I'm like, hey, they said yes. I'm still in that weird space where I'm like, oh wow, people are saying yes to me. I've actually in the 6 months I've been doing this, of all the people I've asked, I've only had 2 people say no, and it was literally only because they said they were just too shy to be on. And I was like, well, that's totally fair. Like,
that's
I'm not
kind of cute in a way. Yeah.
So a little background on Nick's podcast, the Tennis Pod. Why don't you explain to people what it is that you guys do?
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, it's not about tennis, which I think I've said before. But if I could go back and start over, I think I'd choose a different name because it confuses people. But anyway, it's a list about top 10-ish lists. So usually a top 10 list on pretty much any genre, like history, true crime, movies, anything, music. And either myself or my sidekick host, Brandon, brings a top 10-ish list. And it's usually quantifiable, so it's not based on my opinion. So I'm not going to bring a list of my favorite movies. I'm going to bring a list of the highest grossing movies. So something with the facts and figures behind it that the average person could have a chance at guessing. And then the other person tries to guess without any heads up. And then in the course of that, there's fun facts we share and plenty of back and forth, you might say.
Yeah, it's hilarious. You and Brandon's chemistry is amazing. And, as a podcaster and as somebody who spends a lot of my time creating a podcast, I don't get to listen to as many now as I previously did. I was introduced to podcasts by the Ricky Gervais podcast like over a decade ago, when it was like kind of the only podcast in existence. I absolutely loved listening to the three of them talk. And then I didn't do any podcast listening really until Joe Rogan Experience started kind of gaining some traction. And then I did some time on that. And then I burned out on that because I don't know. I think I'm certainly not going to shit talk Joe Rogan or the Joe Rogan Experience because it's legendary. But
right,
he got to the point where he got so famous that he can't do anything without it causing some kind of problem for somebody, and so it just kind of took some of the steam out of it for me.
Yeah, and now every celebrity, big and small, has a podcast. And it makes it really tough for guys like you and me to gain traction. But we're having some success on our show, and I appreciate you listening and asking me to be on yours.
During the pandemic, when I started doing this, my wife kind of handles the like all the back end of it, where she handles all the social media, and she does a lot of research for me for, potential guests, and she just kind of handles that part of it. And she had initially found your guys' podcast, and she's like, this looks like something that you would probably like. You should listen to these dudes. And so I started listening, and it was like I was immediately like a fan. Like I was saying, like your guys' chemistry is hilarious, and the kind of dry ball busting style that you guys have with each other is extra good, because it's not, it's like my other podcast I spent the most time with of any podcast is Last Podcast on the Left, and that's super rowdy, and I love that you guys are like down a notch from that, but just as funny.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because there only one so far, but there was one review early on Apple Podcasts, I think, and the person said, I was really excited to listen to your show because I love top 10 lists and the topics you guys cover sound interesting, but you're just too negative. I can't listen. And I'm like, you bet. Yeah, it's better. It's best that we part ways, because that chemistry that you mentioned with me and Brandon, that is 100% how, because I've known Brandon for 10 years now or something like that. That is exactly how we are in real life, and we've worked together. So the people that know us in real life know that we're constantly busting each other's balls, and usually I'm winning.
Yeah, I would attest to that. You're usually getting the better of Brandon. So you guys are in Oklahoma. Do you know each other from work stuff? Like, how did you guys get linked up?
Yeah, so we are in Oklahoma, Tulsa area, and I met Brandon at a job. It was my first job out of college. He'd probably been there 30, 40 years because he's a very old man. And anyway, we met there. He was in a different department, came to my department. The rest is kind of history. And then when I left that job, I got him a job at my next job. And then he eventually became my boss, which people find funny when they hear that, because again, I'll say that the way I treat Brandon on the show is the way I treat him in real life, despite him being my boss. So it's just, we have an interesting dynamic. But yeah, I've known him through work, and then, obviously outside of work since then.
That's hilarious that he is your boss. Anybody goes and listens to this with that understanding is going to laugh even harder, because now I'm going to laugh harder at it, because that's amazing. Yeah. You guys definitely have good chemistry together, and I love listening to your show. And I think the lists that stand out for me are kind of like like you were mentioning before we started recording, that the music lists are, you said that they're like insanely popular, and that's kind of a no-brainer. Movies and music, because everybody absorbs those pop culture facts, and they can have their own opinion, and you can sit there and be like, oh no, what are you talking about? You can argue back with you guys about all of this stuff, even though it's not you making up the list.
Exactly right. Yeah, because we'll go at, like, the most recent list we did on music was, we looked at Rolling Stone magazine has a pretty famous, well-known list of the 500 greatest albums based on whatever. And Brandon brought that list, and I'm sitting there guessing the list. Well, the average person, no matter what kind of person you are, has heard of these albums, or a lot of them. And so they can agree or disagree with the list. Same with movies, where it gets harder is, like, a recent one we did that wasn't as popular was the most commonly used adjectives in the English language. And that was a list I brought of which adjectives are seen most often in English writing, from all types of writing. That's really hard to guess. I mean, the average English-speaking person could still have a shot, I guess, but it's harder to sink your teeth into. So yeah, we run the gamut on kind of those controversial topics that anyone can get into, but also lesser, easy to guess topics that you can learn something from.
Yeah, I got about halfway through the adjective verb one, and I was like, I can't, because it's like one of those things. A lot of people, when you listen to podcasts, you do it while you're doing stuff.
Yeah.
And so it was like I couldn't do two things at once. I was like, I have to focus too much on what they're talking
Yeah.
about. It's like being in English class again. The one that I can't, it wasn't that long ago, but you did one that was like the fastest land animals.
Yeah. The fastest animals. Yeah.
I loved that one. I loved that episode. That was definitely, I think that was my favorite one for sure of all of them. Because it's like, I got a pretty good idea of what the best 500 records are. If you're going to ask me what the fastest land animals are, I'm going to go with cheetah. And then the list is going to get short after that.
Exactly. But that's the fun part. Like every person knows what animals are, and they know how, and they know which one. They have a decent idea of the top few that are fast. So yeah, we. But then when you listen to that list, you can guess. But then you can also learn, like, I can't think of a fact off the top of my head, but like animal ABC is whatever, just random facts about animals. Like, yeah,
right.
So
which is I absolutely that's like my thing. My thing is to know, I'm a Wikipedia fanatic. Yeah. Like I will sit
same here. I
sit
and read
shit.
in bed and Wikipedia. Yeah, that's kind of what birthed the show. Honestly, is that
makes perfect sense.
Because Brandon and I would, we met through work and we'd travel a lot for work, and so we'd be on airplanes together and stuff. And I would pull up a Wikipedia list of like the best-selling albums of all time, and I would just say, "Okay, Brandon, guess this." And we would basically do the podcast in real life, just back and forth. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, for sure. Like I cannot watch any TV or movie on my couch without having the Wikipedia page for that open.
The exact same way.
Forget it. Forget it. So yeah, I love that. I love that your show is kind of it speaks to me in that same exact way that it speaks to that itch I always have to just know all kinds of random shit. And I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but my wife loves it because she can just ask me like all kinds of shit, and I'll know the answer to some stupid thing that nobody should know.
You mentioned earlier, a minute ago, that your wife helped you with the research and stuff early on, and we need to get our wives together because my wife doesn't do that. My wife does not do that. I'm not sure my wife even listens to my show. So
my wife she does hair in for TV and movies, and so nice. During the pandemic, all the productions were shut down, so she had 6 months like everybody else with literally nothing to do. And so she was like, well, I'll just handle this part of it for you. And I was like, awesome. And so at the time, even she was like listening to every single episode. As soon as I got it edited, it would go to her computer and she would sit on the couch and she would listen to the episode. She'd tell me if there anything that needed to be edited, like, oh, the audio broke up right here. And she'd give me like a timed out like editing sheet. I was like,
man, that is not fair.
It doesn't get any better than that.
You had a head start or an unfair advantage. I'm over here doing it all myself, but
yeah. And then she got hired on to the very first film production that started in Los Angeles, when they started to open everything back up. She was on the very first movie. And so the entire industry was watching their movie to make sure how it was going to go. And so I lost her there for like 3 months and I had to do everything by myself. She still handled the Instagram, which was nice because she's killed it on the Instagram. Like I just have like, she's gotten so many Instagram followers. She just has figured that out. Now I got to get her to do that on Twitter.
Yeah. Dude, I tell you, man, we were talking before we recorded like how much of a full-time job podcasting is. The social media part itself, like, I'm not proud to say, but I'm on social media pretty much all day just because of the podcast. And sometimes I enjoy it and sometimes it gets draining, but first world problems and all that, but
for sure.
Yeah, it's just there's a lot goes into it.
Yeah, it's like one of those things where it's like I don't mind any of it except for Twitter. I for my art, I was on Twitter like a decade ago. because it was like at the time I was like, well, I guess this is how you do it now, because there was no Instagram yet, and it was such a cesspool of lack of human decency that I quit Twitter for like a decade, and then for the show, Christy was like, dude, you have to make a Twitter. And I was like, I won't do it. And she's like, you don't have a choice, man. Like, you have to do it.
You have to do it.
One of the things I will say on Twitter's behalf is that they've done a better job of allowing you to curate your experience way better than at first, when it was like the Wild West. Like, I don't really see politics on my Twitter if I don't want to, which I don't. And so, my Twitter experience has been better. I just need a way bigger audience than I have.
Yeah.
So if you're listening, AWP underscore podcast at Twitter, follow along.
Yeah. And at Tennis Pod on Twitter.
You bet. On a little personal aside is that Nick was one of the first established podcasts that I started talking with, where I got a good connection and rapport going. So we actually conversate regularly on Instagram, on Twitter as well. And that was cool for me in the beginning, as I was like, oh, this dude's, paying me a little attention. Like, that's probably means something positive.
Yeah, no. And, I've listened to your show obviously before now, and you're doing a great job. So
Thank you.
yeah.
So your guys' podcast, to speak a little bit to you and Brandon would do the show while you were just hanging out before you actually started doing the show.
Right.
For a couple years, I have a couple friends on, like I was saying before, like, and people have heard ad nauseum on this show, is that, I'm in my art studio working like all day, every day. Like, I don't really have much of a social life, and I don't really see too many people other than my wife. And when she's on production, like, I might not see her all week. And so I kind of live in this weird, lonely state. And so my personal Facebook page, is my contact with the world. And it's like a weird, like my parents call it my cult. They're like, oh, your cult members were very active on your Facebook page today. Cause I post like a funny meme in my cover photo every single morning. And then the rest of the day is just people commenting on my meme for the day, or anything else. Like, I will post some irreverent rant about how much I hate people who use their cell phone when they drive, shit like that. And then so I just interact with people all day long. And there's a couple people that were regular commenters, guys that I've known my whole life, who people are like, you guys got to do a podcast together. And that's kind of was one of the impetuses, is there was like, oh, maybe I'll do a podcast with my friend Farron. Maybe I'll do it with my friend Rick. Maybe I'll do it with Jason. And there was some discussion. And then finally I was like, I really want to do a podcast where I feature other creative people. And I just want to have guests. I don't want to have just me and one person podcast.
Right.
And so, cause like when you're deciding what kind of podcast you're going to do, there's a lot of options for you, and it's like, I just decided guests was the way to go for me.
Well, so Brandon's the one who turned me on to podcasts, and it was last podcast on the left, by the way. That's the first pod I got into. Still listen to it. Still my favorite. Anyway, we bonded over that. We're both true crime guys, and we started with a true crime pod, or we attempted. We recorded an episode about a local case here in Tulsa. Listened to it, and it was fucking awful. And not only that, but true crime is the most oversaturated. You cannot gain traction in true crime if you don't have a name. And so we gave that up, and and we kind of, that was it for like two-ish years, and then we finally came up with the idea for Tennis Podcast, which is, done very well. I'm happy to say. So yeah, it's just, you got to find your niche, and we found ours.
Yeah, all the other art podcasts I'd listen to with the exception of Adventures in Design, which is, regardless of genre, Adventures in Design is one of the top probably 10 podcasts I've ever heard by anybody. And so I was on his show, and people were like, "Dude, you were like a natural. Like that was a great episode. You should consider doing your own podcast." And that's kind of how I got to eventually where I'm at. But he does a show a day. At least he did before the pandemic. He was doing a show a day, and now he's got like he does a Disney for Designers podcast where, he's down near Disneyland. So he goes to Disneyland and does a show in conjunction with Disney at Disneyland, talking about the design work at Disneyland. It's insane.
That sounds
Mark Bricky is the host, and he kills it. He's such a good host. He was born for it. And so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
A random aside, I don't know why you reminded me of this in your last point there, but sometimes I wonder, like, because we're kind of in this podcast boom right now, like the last few years. How long does this last, right? Do people kind of move on past podcasts? I think of the same thing with like audiobooks, but I don't know. I mean, music has stuck around for, recorded music has stuck around for however many years. Maybe it won't go anywhere, but it's just weird to imagine because there's hundreds. There might be millions of podcasts out there. There's at least hundreds of thousands. And over time, I don't know. It's just interesting to think about.
I think that it's not. I think I tend to think of it as like Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus and all of these kind of sites, places where you can. Podcasts are kind of like that for me, where it's like. It allows people to decide what they're going to intake rather than being forced by network TV where you're like, oh, it's 7:00, Big Bang Theory's on. You know what I mean? It's like you can watch whatever you want, whenever you want. And I think podcasts are like that in the respect that I was talking to my father-in-law who's, he's like 82 years old. And
almost as old as Brandon.
What is your nickname for him? Hot Dog Sidekick?
Well, he's the sidekick host, and he's also, I mean, at some point during this conversation, we should probably touch on the hot dog thing. But yes. Go ahead and finish your point, and then we'll get there.
So my point is I was trying to turn him onto the Dan Carlin Hardcore History podcast.
Oh yeah.
Because that show's insanely good, if not way too long. And because I mean, it really is. I mean, it's more of an audiobook than it is a podcast. And he's like, well, what's a podcast? And I was like, think of it as a radio show that is about something you specifically want to listen to. And you can just go search out whatever that you want to, if you want to listen to a radio show talking about, British cinema from the 1920s. There's a show out there that talks about that, and you can subscribe to it and listen to it. And he's like, well, that sounds fantastic. And I was like, yeah, it's like, it basically,
it really
is
a mind-blowing idea when you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you get your own talk radio show about whatever it is that you want to listen to. And so I don't think it's going to go anywhere because it serves. Exactly. Yeah. Like one of the podcasts I listen to, which is totally, probably a little TMI, is there's a show called the Rialto Report. And this guy interviews and talks about golden age of porn, like 70s, 80s porn stars and porn industry. And like, he'll talk to like a camera guy who like got started when it went from being, like underground in New York City. And he was the like technical advisor for that TV show, The Deuce, which was kind of about the birth of how it went from prostitution into pornography industry and that growth in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's fascinating.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it sounds fascinating because that's something that the average person doesn't like think about. But if they were to sit down and listen to that, they'd be like, oh, this is fucking fascinating. And like you can hear like these porn stars that are like major, huge, famous people from the 80s, and it's like it's like you can sit and listen to Christy Canyon talk about how she got into making pornography, what it was to her life, how like it's incredibly interesting show.
I'm not
and we
like
have
a weird
covered
porn.
the top
I'm not
porn
like a
searches, by the
weird.
way.
I'm not a weird porn addict. But your, I was gonna kind of segue that to that real
Yeah.
quick. Is like I think it was last week you guys did the top searched porn terms, and
Yes.
it was definitely the higher amount of cursing than your normal episodes. You guys
Was it?
are definitely, yeah, there was much more because you had to kind of describe sex acts, right?
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah. It comes
Well,
with the
Brandon did
territory.
anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
Brandon definitely did more than you did, but it was
man.
really funny. It was really, really funny and really interesting.
Brandon knew a lot about porn, huh? But yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. It speaks for itself. I won't say any more about it, but it was a fun episode. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, but just in general, your guys' show always teaches me something, and I think that was one of the things also that I really liked. Well, I think if to dip a little bit into last podcast on the left, the thing that I loved the most about it, what sold me on it, was that they took, because since I was a teenager, I have been like kind of one of those serial killer readers where like I
Same.
only read Stephen King books and I only read serial killer books
Same.
and like almost nothing else in between. And so I had the goods on like every serial killer. Like I know all that information. And last podcast guys would always give it that same information from a completely different angle that you hadn't thought of. And in particular, the Manson family one, where it was like they demystified the entire idea that Charlie was some kind of maniacal genius who like suckered all these kids in with his, evil ways. And it was like, no, man, he was just a shitty opportunist who got lucky and just wanted to keep getting laid with as many young teenage girls as he could. And he'd say whatever he had to make that happen. And all of them were the ones who took all of that shit and turned it into what it became. And not to let Charlie off the hook for any of it. He got everything he deserved.
Right,
but, like the story of Charles Manson in history is the one from the book Helter Skelter. And that's from the prosecutor. That was the prosecutor's view of that, and he stared at me one time and my watch stopped ticking. And it's like, come on,
It's
man.
so fucking ridiculous. Yeah.
Right. And so when you listen to the series from last podcast about the Manson family, it will change your whole idea of how that whole thing went down for the better. And so, things like that from them really, just that different angle on it. And then the ability to take something that is not funny in any way and make it funny without being disrespectful. I mean, that's way more skill than I could ever have. That's for sure.
First of all, Henry Zebrowski might be my favorite person on the planet of any kind, including like my children. And secondly, you're right. They have kind of, I don't know if they were the first one to kind of take that approach of like a comedy, true crime. I mean, they're at least the first one I know of.
First one I've ever heard. Yeah.
Yeah, that they have like, they own that space now. And now it's like, yeah, because that's what we tried to do basically. When I told you how me and Brandon tried a true crime pod first, basically ripped off the last pod model. They own it now. But yeah, if anyone out there has not listened to last podcast on the left, you really are doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, it's Zebrowski is a little too much for my wife, Henry. I kept telling her how great it was, and then we did a couple road trips a couple years ago, and we listened, and it took her a little while to settle in. She doesn't do well with Henry's his side stories, side missions. But I still listen to it. And when I saw the deal that they got from Spotify, I was so happy for them. I was like, well, good. They're now, they make star money, which is what they should make, because they've been doing it for like 7 years, like when no one was listening, and they deserve every single penny that they're getting, and they're getting a lot of pennies.
And they started like you and me, man. And then they over time, I think it's been almost 10 years since their first episode. Yeah. They've grown it little by little, and Yeah, when I first heard about the Spotify deal, because they're Spotify exclusive now.
Yeah.
The
whole
part of me
network is.
Yeah, right. Because the last podcast network. My initial reaction was, well, I don't like the precedent this sets, where now if I have two favorite podcasts, I might have to listen to them on two different apps. However, putting that aside, I later came to the conclusion that you just said, where like, man, fuck it, they deserve that. They've earned that. Let them have it. I would do the exact same thing if I was them. And if Spotify, if you're listening, I'm available to sell out to you.
We both are.
Yeah.
Your guys' show, you guys have been doing it for a couple years now, and you guys, you said right before the pandemic, you had signed with a pretty notable podcast network yourself. That has to feel good.
Yeah. So we are at 2.5 years, just about over 100 episodes we've done. In that 100 episodes, or in that 2.5 years, we've probably missed like less than 8 weeks in total out of 100 something weeks. So yeah, we are proud of that. But where I was going with that is about close to a year ago, we signed. It was right before the pandemic. We signed with the Blue Wire Podcast Network, which is a sports podcast network. They are getting pretty big though. They have some big like NFL stars on their network, and they big sponsors, all that. So it's exciting to see that. But they reached out to us and said they want to build their comedy arm and their pop culture arm. That's why they reached out to us. So we're kind of the one. I don't know if we're at least one of very few comedy podcasts on their network. But yeah, they've been great. We're lucky to have them.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. And it's like, I think there are, I don't know how to break it up, but I think there's, like you were saying when we first got on together, when we were kind of warming up, that the average podcast lasts 3 to 6 months or something like that before people give up on it, because it's a lot of work, first of all. And then if you haven't thought out what your show is going to be and whether or not it can last any longer than that based on that, like, I mean, if you pick like, this is the Iron Maiden record podcast, like you're going to run out of Iron Maiden records to talk about eventually. And so your guys is perfect because you could do lists forever. And I just picked something I knew I could never get tired of talking to people about, which is creative stuff. Like I'm just, whether you're an artist or whether you're a musician or a podcaster or a chef, or if anybody who makes anything, like I'm interested to know how they do it, and what their motivations are. And like, it's funny because like I'll get somebody who hits me up who I haven't talked to or something. They'll be like, they'll just message me, be like, oh, I was listening to that episode with, Isabel Samaras, who painted the Mad Magazine cover, the first woman Mad Magazine cover. And like my mom got a hold of me and she was like, that Isabel Samaras episode was so good. She was fantastic. And like, it was so interesting and I'm like, that's amazing. Cause I was interested. I've been a huge fan of Isabel forever. Shout out Isabel Samaras. And, I couldn't believe she said yes, first of all. And then it was one of those things where I saw that she was the first woman to get a Mad Magazine cover. And I was like, oh, fuck, I'm going to ask her. I have to try. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. You know what I mean? So I asked her and she was like, oh, I'd love to. And I was just like, all right, cool. Yeah. And here we go.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, and you
so
mentioned
it's like,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to put an aside in here that you mentioned your mom listening and like she was thrilled. And I'm like actively trying to make my mom never discover my show. So I don't want my mom to listen to my show. She would faint. Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah, I was in a touring crusty punk band for a while, and I had the guitar player from that band on, and he's like a really well-known heavy metal guitar player. And I've told this story before, but I've been doing artwork for metal and punk bands forever. And And so a bunch of my friends who are metal bands, like death metal bands, really established musicians, decided to start a punk band, and they had me sing for it. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. So I got to tour all over the world and play on stages way bigger than I have any business ever seeing. And so I had him on, and we talked tour stories. And I like literally say in the episode, like, Mom, please, this is the episode to skip. It's just nonstop swearing and stories about drinking way too much. And it's like, please don't listen to this one.
Well, dude, I've never said a swear word in front of my mom ever to this day. I've not said damn in front of my mother.
Oh, wow.
And if you listen to my show, that might shock you because it's the opposite of that on my show. So yeah, I try to maintain the innocent.
Are you from Tulsa? Are you from Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Not originally, but I spent like my adult life here, most of my life.
Oh, okay. So your parents aren't Oklahomans?
No, I'm at Southern California actually.
Oh, wow.
Orange County, yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh,
Anaheim area.
Okay, I did not know that. Mm-hmm. There you go. Just learned something new.
That's where I was born. But we moved up. We actually moved. Well, you don't want my. I'm just trying to think of how much to say.
Yeah, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to.
We ended up in Oklahoma through my dad's work, and been here ever since. And it has its pros and cons. A lot of cons lately. Election season definitely brings out the worst in this state. But yeah, family's here, and it's a cheap ass place to live. So that's why I'm here right now.
I have some friends in Tulsa, and probably 15 years ago, when I was in the video game industry forever as an art director and animator, and when I was first really actively trying to get out of the game industry, I realized that if I wanted to do what I'm doing now, I couldn't afford to do it in Los Angeles at the time. I had 3 kids and stuff at the time. I was raising a family, and so there was talk about Tulsa, and I went and visited a couple times, and I had an art show in Oklahoma City, and I stayed with my friends in Tulsa. So I spent like a week in Oklahoma, and I really loved it there, in the respect that like everybody's super nice. Like you go to a restaurant and the waiter, that's their job. In California, you go to a restaurant, especially in Los Angeles, the waiter's an actor or a writer. That's not their job. And not that they don't do a good job, but when your job is to serve people food and that's all you're going to do, is a different mindset to it. And so it was like a weird atmospheric difference for me. And I was like, I could totally live here. And then I pulled up to an intersection once, and there was a church on all 4 corners. And I was like, maybe we need to reconsider.
I know. Well, I wish I had a stat in front of me. I could look it up, I'm sure. But
it has the most churches. It has the most churches of any state in the United States.
Is that a fact? I didn't realize that.
Per capita. Hey, you could do a 10-ish list on churches and states.
That's not a bad idea. But so that doesn't surprise me. I was going to guess it'd be in the top few. But in addition, lately, I don't know how political we want to get, but there's like Trump stands everywhere.
There are here. There are in Los Angeles. It's not a Southern or Bible Belt or conservative area thing. It's a thing. And I'd imagine a lot heavier presence than in Los Angeles for sure.
Yeah,
we had those Trump parades of giant trucks through Beverly Hills, giant lifted 4x4 trucks through Beverly Hills with Trump flags on them. So, we're not immune.
Tulsa had the first Trump rally after COVID.
I remember that. Yeah.
Which is the first time, I think, ever a president has been to an active president has been to Tulsa. So I remember like an in-law telling me like, I don't care what you think of him. It's still the president of the United States. You still have to, it'd still be great to be there. And it's just like, it's Oklahoma.
Not if it's going to make me sick.
Yeah.
I don't care who it is. I'm not going to see Metallica if it's the first concert back after, you know what I mean? Like,
right. Yeah. I did see Metallica in that venue. Before
there
COVID.
You go. I seem to remember listening to your Rolling Stone Top Records episode that you're like kind of a 90s grunge rock guy, like Alice in Chains, Nirvana type of stuff.
That's me. Yep.
Yeah, so that doesn't surprise me too much because Metallica was in their height, height of their popularity, but for me, not at the height of their of their powers.
I know. I think I've said this on the show, but like Metallica super fans are like, it's 80s Metallica, and I'm actually like one of the few that prefers their like 90s and on. And I love it all. First of all, I love the 80s too, but like I really like their newer albums, and Saint Anger is my favorite Metallica album. So I know people always cringe when I tell them that, but it's just different. I'm not saying it's their best. I'm not saying it's their like artistic best. I'm just saying I like it. Yeah.
I think most people would say that Master of Puppets is their best record, but that's not my favorite record of theirs. Ride the Lightning is my favorite record of theirs because it's the most raw. It was like before.
That's my favorite.
It was like when they were still on their way up and they were still like it was furious. You know what I mean? And then with Master of Puppets, it was like, oh, we can sit down and show people how good we are at this. And it wasn't about just trying to tear the roof off. It was about it was about a whole range of things. And my thing with Saint Anger is that the production was just I can't even get started on how bad the production is on that. But for me the thing
I like the story behind it too. Like if you've seen the documentary, like that I connect that with the album too.
Sure.
I don't know if that's where you're about to go, but
what my thing with that record is that the really good thing about Metallica, there were good songs in this Saint Anger record, and I just think that it was just produced wrong, and it was recorded kind of at a bad time for them as human beings, and so it wasn't everything that it could have been, because there's really good songs in there. Even if you are a fan of the 80s Metallica stuff, you can hear it in there. But the production, it's so I don't know why they did what they did with the production on that. And one of my very good friends is the singer and guitar player for a very, very popular death metal band, Exhumed. And he's a Metallica head. Like he's like you. He's like, I like all of it. And it's like, not all of it, right? No, he likes all of it. And it's like, come on, Harv, like shout out Matt Harvey. It's like, you don't like all of it, do you? And it's like, I like Metallica. I'm like, okay, fuck you. Nobody likes that record that they did with Lou Reed. Nobody likes that record.
I gotta tell you, man. I mean, well, yeah, I've said my piece. I like. There's not a single Metallica album that I don't like.
Okay,
like your friend Harv.
All right.
Like. Yeah.
Yeah, Matt Harvey is a Metallica fan, and it sucks.
What's his favorite?
I recorded if I had to guess, I would say it's either Kill 'Em All or Ride the Lightning, just because he's like an OG metal dude. He really likes like heavy metal. You know what I mean? Like before it was thrash metal, before it was death metal, when it was just like heavy metal, like he loves that stuff. I wish I could come up with some bands that I can think of off the top of my head that would fit into that. But he is in a band. He is in kind of like a retro metal band called Pounder. And if you like ripping guitar lead, 80s movie soundtrack type of metal, you should check out Pounder, because they will be right up your alley. It is heavy metal from the 80s, and they're a fantastic band.
Cool.
But
you were about to say something a minute ago.
Metallica digression aside.
Don't bring up Nirvana, because then we'll go down another one.
Well, I was one of those people who was an early adopter. Like, when they were putting out demos, I was still in my, thrash metal band from the 80s. And a friend of mine, my very lifelong best friend, Mike Murphy, shout out Mike Murphy, was working at a record store. And so he was starting to get all the Sub Pop stuff, like as promo stuff. Before it was even stuff they could really carry in their store, they were getting it. And he was bringing all these like demos and like early, kind of grunge stuff around. And I was like, this band Nirvana is so good. They are such a great band. And like bands like Tad and Green River and like the original wave of those Seattle bands, they were all so good. And by the time it got to the rest of the world, it had been bought up by major labels and kind of watered down quite a bit. But I am a Nirvana fan. And at their height, I was like a super fan. But the thing that's weird about Nirvana for me is that they didn't stick. Like, I don't listen to Nirvana. I don't not like Nirvana, but I never put them on just to listen to them, really, unless it's Bleach. Like, I'll listen to the Bleach record because I love that record so much, but not very much. Not like some other 90s bands,
Yeah. That's interesting you say that. First of all, there's a part of me that is, a big part of me that's jealous of someone like you that kind of lived through it. In real time, right?
Right. I'm old.
Yeah. Well, I don't even mean to say that. It's just like
no, it's fair.
Yeah. Every Nirvana is my favorite band. Like Nirvana tattoo, Nirvana stuff behind me on the wall.
Wow.
But it's all in retrospect. Like I didn't even buy my first. Let's see. Kurt had been dead for 10, 12 years by the time I bought my first Nirvana CD. So. Yeah. Anyway,
you like Alice in Chains and that stuff too. Yeah, that's kind of your.
Yeah, that's my. If I had to pinpoint like one type of music that I like it most, it would be Alice in Chains and Nirvana, both top 5 for me. Metallica is kind of different than those, but it's also probably top 5, top 10. But Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, all those, yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of a 2-record Soundgarden person. Like I liked Louder Than Lovin', I liked Bad Motor Finger, and then again, by the time they became like a kind of radio band, I was like, I was kind of, I spent the 90s buried all the way up to my eyeballs in death metal and grindcore, so I didn't listen to a lot of like radio music in the 90s. Right. But it was hilarious that I was an ice hockey goalie started playing when I was like 7, and I was a little bit of a prospect. I was never going to be an NHL goalie by any stretch, but I had a couple seasons where I played in the professional roller hockey league. This is called the RHI.
Wow.
And it's funny because one season, the first season that I played, the entire team was the Tulsa Oilers ice hockey team. They just shipped the whole team to California, put them on rollerblades, and that was the Oakland Skates. And so I was kind of the reserve goalie for that team.
That's a hell of a story. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And then the second season I played, they did the same thing with the Richmond Renegades of the East Coast Hockey League. They just kind of brought the whole all these guys had NHL contracts pretty much. Like I'd say 50% of the guys had NHL contracts. And I think only 1 or 2 ever ended up playing in the NHL, but it was professional level hockey. Yeah. And, but just, that league just didn't last very long. But I was also a reserve goalie for a season for the San Jose team, which is where I lived at the time and where I grew up. And me and the 2 other goalies, they were both Canadian guys, and we were stretching one day. Like the goalies go off in the corner to stretch and get warmed up before while the team does other stuff. And we were all sitting and talking, and they're like, "Oh yeah, the team's really great because we played in the same arena as the San Jose Sharks did. It was like a full arena setup, and they're like, oh, it's great. The team, they give us tickets to every concert at the arena, and like we're gonna go see Bryan Adams. And I was like, oh great, and they're like, oh, you don't like Bryan Adams? And I was like, nah, I like listen to like death metal. And they're like, what, like Soundgarden?
Oh no.
And I was like, no, not like Soundgarden, man.
That's probably like if my parents were to listen to one Soundgarden song, they'd be like, what is this is this what that death metal they always talk about? Yeah, that's funny.
Oh yeah, that is a little weird aside to that, but I do like Bad Motor Finger for me is probably the best '90s rock record. If you had to make me nail it down, that record is fantastic record.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
I mean, it's as close to Black Sabbath as you can get without it being vintage era Black Sabbath, and I'm a huge Black Sabbath fan. So,
yeah.
Do you go back? Do you listen to much older stuff, or are you kind of more of your generation?
I a little bit. So
I can definitely tell there was a lot of '60s music you didn't listen to from your guys' Rolling Stone list, because there are people you were like, yeah, I don't even know who this is.
I mean,
I'm like, how do you not know who Joni Mitchell is, man?
Yeah, see, you're exposing me. Now none of your listeners are going to fucking give me a shot here.
No, it's fine. You ruined everything when you said you liked modern Metallica.
Oh, no, I know. I get so much heat for that in like every friend circle I'm in. Anytime
I'm kidding.
No, I know you're kidding, but it's as sure as the sky is blue that if you talk to anyone and you're like, oh, you like Metallica? And then you say Saint Anger, they're like, oh. Like, I don't know if I've met one person that's been like, oh, Saint Anger's also my favorite. Or
yeah, also, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that.
But
I didn't hate the one after was Death Magnetic, right?
Yeah, Death Magnetic.
That one wasn't bad, but another small digression. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, and I don't mean to digress back into Metallica too much.
Yeah.
The thing with Metallica for me, the thing was when he changed the way he sang, it was over for me. Like I don't care what the music sounds like now. His voice, and I totally get it. I'm not one of those people who's like, he's a sellout and I hate me. And he just does something with his voice now that's definitely meant to appeal to way more people than the screaming. It's just, it doesn't appeal to me as a person. And, Metallica doesn't owe anybody anything. They could put out a classical jazz record if they wanted, and everybody can go fuck themselves. It's Metallica's job as an artist to do whatever they want. So I'm definitely not one of those people who's like, screw you, Metallica. It's just, they just moved on to a sound that isn't as appealing to me as the older stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, that's fair.
Back to Joni Mitchell.
No, let's not talk about that.
I think there was like a Bob Dylan record too, and you were like, "Yeah, I don't know how Bob Dylan ended up this high." And I was, and for me, it was just funny because it was a Bob Dylan record I wouldn't put even in his top 10 records.
No, like I know the names of a few Bob Dylan records, but that one did not stand out to me. What was it? Blood on the Tracks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that is a great record, but
I'm not saying it's not. I just haven't listened to it.
Sure, of course, man. Like my kids have never listened to Bob Dylan records. Of course, like that's like getting mad at a 30-year-old because they've never used a push dial, a rotary phone. It's like those things didn't exist when they were kids. Like, don't get mad at people. Like, you always see those like old people memes where it's like, back in my day, we jumped our bike off of a 50-foot cliff with no helmet, and we managed to live just fine. And it's like, it didn't mean it was a good idea.
Right.
and don't blame kids now for not wanting traumatic brain injury. Don't get mad at parents for that.
Yeah. Hey, you brought another question to mind here. I think I might have asked Brandon this on my show, but I'll ask you. The history of music, as far as the history of humans, is extremely recent, right? It's like as far as recorded music I'm talking. It's been like a little over 100 years maybe. 200 years from now, assuming we're all still here, are people still talking about like the Beatles and Metallica? Or is there just been so much turnover in new music since then that they just kind of get more and more buried in time? Or are they just so timeless that people will always talk about them? Because right now, the Beatles was a long time ago, and people still talk. Everyone knows the Beatles, but in 200 years, I don't know. There could be, So just what's your take on that?
Well, my personal take would be that, I don't think anything goes away forever anymore. Especially moving forward, because we'll just have digital archives of literally everything.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to access, I mean, do people still read books that are 200 years old? So
Yeah.
I would assume, like just as a personal anecdote about that, a personal anecdote about that would be that I listen to a lot of really, really old jazz and blues music. And so like I'll listen to Django Reinhardt. Those records are 80, 90 years old, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not that much difference. And I'll listen to that quite frequently. And so I wouldn't see why not, especially somebody like the Beatles, I guess. You know, it's like there will be 100 million artists and records that never get listened to 200 years from now. But I think there are things like the Beatles that will definitely still get listened to because they're pillars on which all other things that came after them were made. And I think you'll see the same thing with like, you know, like there'll be certain like rap acts, like like Dr. Dre will still be a thing 200 years from now because he was a cornerstone. But that is a very interesting question. It's a very,
I guess
how do we receive music in 200 years is an interesting question to me. Like how is it, do we have implants that just beams it directly into our brain? Like what does that look like?
I'd say the likelihood of that is more likely than not. I don't know. But, you know, it's also one more follow up on the Beatles example is, you know, you mentioned those jazz artists you listen to that 80 or 90 years old. One difference between them and the Beatles is a 12-year-old kid today, even if they've never listened to a song, they've heard of the Beatles, right?
True.
So in 200 years, yes, the Beatles will still be a thing. Yes, you can still find them if you want. Anyone can find them if you want, but they're still like top of mind for the general public. Although, as I say that, I mean, I guess like Mozart still is. So,
sure, yeah. As a small note in the same vein about your guys' episode and about that list from Rolling Stone, one of the things that you guys talked about quite a bit, because for some reason we bought our house 3 years ago, and a year ago we started getting somebody else's Rolling Stone. It wasn't even like it always came. It just started showing up at my house a year ago. I don't know how or why. And so I had seen that issue. And when you guys are talking about it, one of the things that was interesting to me looking at the magazine and listening to you guys talk, one of the things that you guys kind of do in general, but in this one in particular was like, this time it's gone down this many numbers. This record's gone down this many numbers. And, you know, this is what the top 10 looks like. And it's different than it was last time it was discussed. And one of my problems with Rolling Stone forever is that Jan Werner can't not blow the Beatles as often as he possibly can. And that's fine. Like if that's his favorite band and that's the band that was the most important band to his generation, I get that. But that just like you're running a magazine, bro. Like you gotta do something different with it. So the fact that when the new top 500 came out and there were so many fewer Beatles records on it, and there were some more newer records on it, I thought that was a positive sign that maybe they were going to just not force feed the world the Beatles and to be a Rolling Stone forever.
Yeah, I think there was one Beatles album in the top 10, and if memory serves, there might have been 2 or 3 in the top 10 before.
I think it was like 10 in the top 10 for a long time. I don't think there are 10 Beatles records, but I'm not a Beatles guy. Like they're one of those bands that I can totally appreciate what they did for music, and I can appreciate on a technical standpoint, and I can appreciate them on a cultural standpoint. But I'm a Rolling Stones person more than I am a Beatles person. But that said, there are 2 Beatles songs that are in my top 20 favorite songs of all time. So I don't hate the Beatles. I just
they're not your thing.
I kind of figured it out recently because I did a deep dive. I was like, you need to sort out what's going on with you and the Beatles. And so I did like a Spotify deep dive. And because that's the kind of nerd I am.
Yeah.
And I figured it out finally. I just don't like John Lennon's voice. I like all of the other Beatles stuff. There are a couple John Lennon songs that I like Norwegian Wood. I think that's just a fantastic song. But I just don't like his voice very much. And I think that, I mean, nobody cares about the Ringo songs, so I don't have to be on the hook for that. But I love most of the songs by the Beatles. I love are the ones that McCartney and Harrison sing. And so I was like, oh, okay, you just don't like John Lennon, because I loathe his solo work. Like,
yeah,
I cannot
loathe.
be, I cannot be exposed to John Lennon's solo work without actual anger. Them and U2 are the two bands that I
now U2 I
can't with it. And now, Coldplay's not high on my list either.
Is this based on like just the music by itself, or is there part of it that's like the person behind the music too, or both?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of that. In all cases. Well, for like a band like Coldplay, to me, that's just the most boring music you could ever, like, I don't understand what it's entertaining about it. Everybody has their own taste, and I listen to death metal. I have terrible music taste, but I also listen to all kinds of music, and so even in that kind of easy, like bands like the War on Drugs or Future Islands that are in that same kind of vein of bands as someone like Coldplay, like, they're incredibly boring to me. Like, they don't bring anything to the table that is, well, there's nothing I can grab onto at all there.
Once they've made it, and I'm not intimate with Coldplay's work at all, but it's like, once you make it, you just play it safe, just wrap it up, package it up just right, send it out.
That goes back to our Metallica conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah, well.
You got to keep hitting those numbers. Once you're in the big time, you got to keep hitting numbers. Yeah. And so you've got to make your music more listenable to more numbers. Hey, look, man, Slayer was my favorite band for most of my life. And then they put out like 4 records in a row that were exactly that. And I was like, out. You're out of here.
Oh, wow. You're out. So you won't buy their next album?
Well, they're done now, so no more Slayer. But I didn't buy the last 3 records at all. And like, I have every other Slayer record on vinyl. Like, I'm talking about like in the 1980s, went to the record store and bought and still have in my record collection Slayer records. But I even worse than that, I have old hardcore punk records that, like, and one that's come up before, that's kind of like a holy grail record, is I have the Beastie Boys started out as a hardcore punk band in like 1981, and they put out their first record it's just a punk record called Pollywog Stew, and I have a first pressing vinyl of that I bought when it came out, and like, you can't get that. Like, you can't get that without spending in like the 4 figures probably in a lot of cases, but I got one. So I have records that go all the way back, but
that's awesome. Man, you're touring the world with a band. You're playing ice hockey as a goalie, and you got a one-of-a-kind Beatles album. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, just like sitting on my ass in this chair editing my podcast, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, well, you probably have led a much more less stressful life. I was like my first job, I was a repo man. Like, that was the family business. So I was repossessing cars when I was like 20 years old. And then I figured out really quick that job wasn't for me, and that I had some art skills and I could probably apply those to not.
Is that job of repo man? Sorry. Is that job of repo man? You said it's not for you. Is it for anybody? Is there anybody that job is for?
Oh my God. Yes, for my father. Oh my God, my dad loved it. My dad loved that job. That was, weird. That was the family business. My dad is a fantastic person. He's very, he's had even a more crazy life than me. Although he would say different, because I've done I got to see the world with the band and play professional hockey, and he didn't. But, he was like in Vietnam. He like lied about his age when he was 17 and was in Vietnam when he was 17. Oh, wow. He wasn't even an adult yet. And so when he came back from the war, like one of the jobs he could get was like collections. And back in the 1960s, like, the person who called to collect the bill was also the person who would come and take your car if you couldn't pay it. It was one job. Now there's a collections department, and then it gets sent to a different repo agency. So it's like all disconnected. But he started out in the 60s where it was like, like if you had a, like a rent to own TV and you didn't pay it, he went to your house and came in and unplugged your TV and took it and put it in the truck and left with it. So he was like a repo man, like old school. And he worked his way up the ladder to the point where he was in a suit behind a desk managing a collections department. And so my dad's midlife crisis when he was probably in his mid 40s, is he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to open my own repo agency, and I'm going to go back. I'm going to get back in the tow truck, and I'm going to go back out, and I'm going to live my life and have some adventures. And so he started a repo agency. And then I worked for another company before. When he was suit and tie guy, he got me a job at a repo agency. And I was just transporting cars. And in California, you have to be 21 to get a repossessor license. It's the same license as a private investigator. And so the license says private investigator, repossessor right on it. And so I worked learning the business for a couple years, and then started repoing. And then when he opened his agency, I left and went and worked for him. And we were like a 3-man operation. And my dad loved it, man. He absolutely loved being
stories.
A repo man.
Jesus.
Oh my God. Well, you don't do that job for very long without having a lot of stories.
Yeah. Fuck, that's a whole other podcast. There needs to be, dude, I'm serious.
There has to be a Repo Man podcast.
Yeah, but if not, there you go. Like, just get a Repo Man on the mic and just talk about old stories.
I am in constant contact with a guy through Facebook that we worked together as Repo Men for a long time, and I could have him on. He would love it. But I am in the process of getting my Patreon together, and just little note to you, your Patreon is the only Patreon I subscribe to. Period.
That means a lot. Thank you.
So I'm getting my Patreon together, and because I have guests, all of my Patreon content is going to be extra stories I get from guests, or I've recorded a couple of my good Repo Man stories, and I have enough of those. I could only have those on my Patreon and keep people interested.
That's a great idea.
Yeah,
that's
car
money.
Chases, like crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And then like I'm starting that YouTube art channel, and then my Patreon will take care of both those audiences, the podcast audience and the art channel audience. It's going to be a twofer, so everybody's going to get tons of extra content on my Patreon.
Yeah. Coming soon.
I just loved it. January? Yeah. And right now, I record things. Because me and my wife are super overachievers, what I do is I record like 3 months worth of episodes at a time. So like I'll record 2 guests a day for like a month. And I'm talking like 3 days a week. Like I'll get 12 to 20 episodes done in a bulk.
That's the way to do it, man.
I don't know exactly when your episode is going to be on. It will probably be sometime in January, but the Patreon is coming in January. And I was really stoked when you guys sent me the Patreon, like, thanks for signing up kit, and it was like stickers and like all kinds of stuff, and I was like super excited.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, and the Patreon, I pushed against it for a long time because it's like, I don't want to do it. It's weird. I'm going to have 5 people, and it's weird asking for money, and a lot of reasons not to do it. But it's worked out nicely, and it's allowed me and Brandon to connect more personally with people too. Because
I think that's like a big part. That's a huge part of being a podcaster is people want to feel like they're like your friend, like they're a part of the show. They're sitting here with me and you right now, listening to their friends talk. And that is what has been successful about my show is everybody, when they talk to me about my podcast, is like, oh, it just sounded like I was sitting around listening to a couple of my friends talk. And if that's, I mean, I just don't know how I could do it any better than that if that's what people take away from it, you know?
Yeah. And well, the thing about podcasting too, to kind of revisit something we touched on before is, there's so many podcasts out there and almost all of them don't make it. You have to go into podcasting. I guess this is my advice of the day for anyone like thinking of getting into podcasting or whatever, but you have to get into it accepting that you're probably not going to get millions or thousands of listeners, or maybe even hundreds. You got to do it for you. And you and I are both lucky to have, a decent amount of listeners, but you're never satisfied. You always want more.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm just getting started.
Goal. Yeah. When I first started, I'm like, well, I just want 100 listeners, and I'll be set. And my first episode had like 4 downloads. And I finally hit 100 after, I don't know how many episodes it was, but we finally hit 100 and I'm like, okay, now I want 200. And it just keeps going. And then it's like, I want 500. And once you get there, you're not like, great, now I can stop hoping. You always want more. Anyway, that kind of goes against my previous point of just don't do the podcast. But you got to enjoy it.
You have to enjoy it, but with anything, if that takes as much time as this does, that
right,
you want it to succeed for sure. I think the thing that most people don't know about podcasting, who listen to podcasts, or even people who are getting in, is that there's only one Joe Rogan, and there's only one last podcast on the left, and then there's like 999,999 of us. And so you cannot do it for monetary gain. You could only hope that you're good enough at it and you like doing it enough that you reach monetary gain down the road. But if you think you're getting into podcasting to like make it rich, you need to do something.
Right. If your goal coming in is to monetize, you're in the wrong game. You might monetize eventually, but that should be a bonus. That shouldn't be the end goal.
Unless you're famous, you know what I mean? Like unless you're famous, like for instance, and this is 100% positive comment. I wouldn't denigrate like, oh, famous people just get it easy. That's not my point at all. They are famous, and if they want to make a podcast, they deserve to have their podcast listened to a lot because that comes along with that. But my wife is a personal hairstylist of Jenna Fisher from The Office, and
I need to talk to your wife now,
her and
that's a side
Jenna and I've never really watched The Office, so I don't really even know that much about it.
The other
the blonde,
Angela.
They do a podcast together, and it was like, I mean, they signed like a very lucrative deal right out of the gate, and they were getting like 500,000 streams like right away. You know what I mean, or some crazy thing like that. And it was like, well, okay, of course, that's how that is in that respect,
Yep.
And so like I don't, of course that's how it's gonna go. But for me, like it definitely was like I wanted to pick something I knew I wasn't gonna get tired of, and I'm one of those eternally positive people in the respects of that. I just don't ever consider that things aren't going to go well. If I just decide to do something, I just keep doing it until I get it where I want it. Like with my goalie mask business, I custom airbrushed ice hockey goalie masks. And that has been one of my businesses for the last probably 7 or 8 years. And it was like that. Like I painted one and I was like, this is what I'm going to do now. And then within a year, it was my full income. Like I wasn't doing any band merchandise or anything awesome. Really. The band merchandise stuff had become my side hustle, where it was my main hustle forever. And the goalie mask business, like I was doing 60 hours a week inside of a year, but had replaced my regular design income inside of 6 months of that. And so that's just kind of how I do everything. Whereas I'm like, well, you'll just figure it out. You'll figure out how to make it popular or whatever it is you're doing.
Well, I have to
And so, you know, I don't know. I don't suspect that I won't in the long term get where I want to get with this. It's just, you know, it became clear very quick, like, oh, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Yes, that's the perfect way to sum it up. But, you know, one other thing about podcasting that I didn't expect coming in is all of the new skills I have self-taught myself since starting a podcast. I know nothing about like audio engineering or audio editing, and I'm pretty good at it now. Like, you know, self-taught. And I didn't know anything about design, and I'm nowhere, I'm not you. I'm not even close. But I've learned like at least the basics in Photoshop and stuff like that I wouldn't have learned without the podcast. And I was already in marketing, but for someone that isn't in marketing, you're going to learn marketing running your own podcast. So yeah, it's an adventure. But, you know, we glossed over something that we can't gloss over. Your wife was the hairstylist for Jenna Fischer. Was that during the Office years as well?
No. She kind of just, Jenna had a show on in the last couple years called Splitting Up Together on, I think it was ABC, with, okay. Oh my God, I can't remember his name. It's Goldie Hawn's son. I can't remember his name for the life of me. That's terrible. But they had a show, they had an ABC show, and my wife started working on that show, not really doing Jenna's hair, doing everybody else's hair. Cause the way it works is there's like a department head, personal hairstylist, and they kind of handle like the big people. And then there's like a key hairstylist, which is what my wife primarily does. And they kind of handle everybody else, like all the kids on the show. And my wife works on the Netflix show Atypical. She is the key hairstylist on that. And she literally does everybody's hair except for Jennifer Jason Leigh and Michael Rappaport. And so my wife was working on that show, and her and Jenna became friends through the show just because they're, you know, coworkers. And then when the show ended and Jenna started having like, oh, I have to be on the Ellen show, she would just call Christy and be like, hey, can you come and do my hair for the Ellen show? Or she's going to be on some award show, and it's like, oh, can you come and do my hair for this award show or whatever? And then it just started being where like whenever she needed her hair done, she just called Christy, and Christy would go over there and hook it up. So when she started doing the podcast, all of the promotion for that, Christy was handling all of her hair stuff. And like, you know, she had an endorsement with like Smirnoff vodka, and she had to do a bunch of like Instagram photo shoots, and Christy did all of her hair for all that stuff. And then totally rando, like a couple weeks ago, Jenna was like, well, things are starting to kind of open back up, and I'm going to get busy again. So can you just come over and cut my hair? And so my wife went over, and like, I guess she's just like, you know, her personal hairstylist now, which is awesome because my wife is insanely talented at what she does. And, you know, I've actually had my wife's personal hairstylist on this show.
Well, dude, I was going to say, you have your in with Jenna Fischer. You gotta start sneaking in those asks. Like, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I already tried to do my big over, like way too big ask. As I did, I tried, like I said,
you gotta
like,
shoot your shot.
The answer's always, like Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yep.
But I did a bunch of t-shirt work for Ice-T's personal t-shirt label. And so I emailed with him. Like I have his personal email, and I was like, hey dude. And I just like hit him up, and I never heard back from him.
No.
You know, whatever.
Well, hey, imagine if he had said yes, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. Probably.
Well, you know, no, I definitely would. Yeah,
but
that, you know, and just as like I know you were kidding, but on that note, in a serious way, I will always just have the people on. If this show became some crazy success where I was having Elon Musk on this show or whatever, I would still just have on like my favorite like death metal bands and like podcasters that I like. I will still always have the people that I want to talk to on. It's kind of the same way with my design stuff. When I got super huge into doing design and merch for big bands, and I was doing, you know, I did a shirt for Paul McCartney, and I did, you know, shirts for Metallica, and I did shirts for Lionel Richie, like Led Zeppelin, like the biggest bands in the world. And but I always still did t-shirts for like, you know, the Scandinavian grindcore band that, you know, is like, you know, like that could, because that's what I want I always involve the things in my life that I want my life to be. And so no matter what happens with the show, I'll always have the people that I want to have on my show because I find them interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, why else would I do this if it wasn't interesting?
That's what we were just talking about before. You got to do the pod for you to some degree. So that's cool.
Dude, totally.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to let you go, man. It's late in Tulsa time.
Yeah.
I totally appreciate you coming on, dude. This has been a really, really awesome talk. And I know we had talked a little bit about some merch stuff that you maybe wanted me to have work on some merch stuff for you. And I'm looking forward to a time when I'm not quite so busy.
Of course,
that
yeah.
we can actually do that.
No pressure.
Because like I said, like my toy work never went away. And now I got podcast work, and now I'm trying to make this damn art channel. And it's like,
yeah, you got a lot of shit in the hopper. And you're trying to get Jenna Fisher on the show all at the same time. So, yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. Like, you know, like, I think I maybe mentioned to my wife, I was like, how long do you think I have to be doing this before we can try to call in that favor? And she's like, dude, there's no way. I'm not asking her that.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, come on.
My wife would never bring it up either if it was her. So, yeah.
You know, my wife has gotten me some people though. Like her hairstylist is also the hairstylist for like Katy Perry, and so like, you know, I had Katy Perry's, you know, the blue wig. Like I had the person who made that blue wig on my show, so it's not that far away from any of that.
Cool,
you know,
man. I just have a grumpy old man Brandon on my show that. Like, I never have anyone cool on my show. So, yeah.
You made that choice for yourself.
I'm stuck with him. He's my appendage. But look, dude.
Well, I'm glad you're stuck with them because your show is, like I said, it's my favorite podcast right now. And I
appreciate that.
And I love it. And I want everybody who listens to my podcast to go listen to the Tennis podcast, not the tennis podcast.
No, there's no tennis talk at all, except one time on a sports episode. What was that? Most popular sports, I think. Yes, dude, thanks for the endorsement. Thanks for having me on. I never dreamed we'd go into all the Metallica sidetracks and all that, but that was a lot of fun, and I'll come back anytime.
That's what's great about.
Yeah.
That's what's great about this show is all the digressions.
Yeah, it's great.
And you can't not talk about heavy metal or punk rock on this show. No matter who you are.
Right. I think that's a rule now.
You're not going to get away with it. I don't think anybody's going to get off the hook for that.
But dude, next time that you go into some sort of deep dive on heavy metal with a guest, ask the Saint Anger question. Like, I'm curious if you find someone else that likes Saint Anger. I want to know.
Well, I could guarantee Matt Harvey likes it, but I'll ask Harv when I have him on. I'll ask him.
Cool.
All right, cool, man. Thank you again, and I'll talk to you soon, Nick.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
Bye.